Namaskar. Welcome to Chapter 6 of Economics 101. In this video, we will continue looking at the fiscal deficit aspect of the budget. But before we start off on today's topic, a quick recap of what we did in the last video. We now know a budget is a list of inflows and outflows of the government. Inflows and outflows of what? Of money or cash, simplistically speaking. Generally in India, the outflows have been more than the inflows. So our budget runs in deficit. I'm talking about the central government budget, okay? Because inflows minus outflows will give a negative number. Deficit is of three types we saw. Primary deficit, which is inflows minus outflows, but excluding outflows which are due to interest payments on government borrowings. Then revenue deficit, which is revenue type inflows, which is not including capital inflows, minus revenue type outflows, which is not including capital outflows. This is the revenue deficit. Most important thing for us to know is fiscal deficit, which is simple. It is total inflows minus total outflows. In this video, as I said earlier, we'll be discussing the fiscal deficit. Especially for lay persons, this concept is very important to look at in the budget. You can say in many ways, this is like the summary of the budget. Fiscal deficit we've seen earlier is total inflows minus total outflows. It is a reflection of the government's fiscal policy. Now, in a country, there are two broad economic policies. One is known as the fiscal policy. This is from the point of view of the government. Government controls the fiscal policy. And the other is monetary policy, which is from point of view of the central bank, Reserve Bank of India in the case of India. And this is controlled by the central bank. In this video, we are introducing only to the fiscal policy, which is the government side of things. Basically, fiscal policy means government decisions of spending money and taxing people. If government decides to spend more and tax less, that is increase outflow and reduce inflow, fiscal deficit will obviously go up. It's a simple relationship. Such kind of policy is known as an expansionary fiscal policy. If government decides to spend less and tax more, then fiscal deficit will reduce because inflows have gone up and outflows have reduced. So this is known as a contractionary fiscal policy. Now, for an elected government, what's the easiest way to win elections? An expansionary fiscal policy, because it is very popular. Basically, give everything to people for free, give them a lot of sops, give them a lot of freebies, and then reduce taxes as well. So everyone will love the government and will vote them back. But such kind of policy causes a jump in fiscal deficit. Remember, expansionary fiscal policy will cause fiscal deficit to go up. Now, what is the problem if fiscal deficit goes up, right? The problem is this, that the government can plug the gap between what it spends, its outflow, and what it earns, its inflow, only by borrowing money. The government has no other mechanism to make money, right? So to the extent of fiscal deficit every year, the government takes new loans, right? So every year central government takes new loans to the extent that there is a difference between inflow minus outflow to the extent of fiscal deficit. The total value of such loans as of today is 91 lakh crore. Now note, this is a cumulative number. So these are the total of loans taken over so many past years, minus the loans that may have been repaid in the interim. So every year, small fiscal deficit minus the repayments, that number today stands at 91 lakh crore rupees. Now, okay, it needs to borrow, but who will it borrow from? See, ultimately it borrows from the people. So people like you and me, suppose if we were allowed to buy government bonds, it would be directly us. But in reality, it is borrowing from organizations like banks where you put your money in as deposits. It's borrowing from Reserve Bank of India. It is borrowing from mutual funds who invest in government bonds. It's borrowing from insurance companies. So between insurance companies, banks and Reserve Bank of India, nearly 80-85% of government bonds are held. Now, if government fiscal deficit is large, then they end up borrowing most amount of money available in the market, right? So there is a certain amount of money to lend with the banks based on what money we deposit with them. and the government itself has a large fiscal deficit, so it needs to borrow a large amount of money to meet its payments. Thus, the banks will just end up lending to the government because it's the safest borrower as well, right? This will leave banks with very little amount of money to lend to other deserving people like private businesses or individuals like you and me. This is known as the crowding out effect. Basically, government demand for loans crowds out other deserving borrowers. Since very little money is left after government has taken its money, taken its requirement for borrowing, interest rates start to rise because interest is the price of money, right? And when supply of money reduces, the price of money will go up, kind of like what's happening with onion in today's market. The supply of onion has gone down, whether for natural reasons or someone is hoarding, that's a different story. But because supply of onions has gone down in India, the price of onions is going up. In the same way, if government sucks away most of the money available for lending, then the remaining money needs to go at a very high price because there are many people demanding a scarce commodity, money in this case. What happens when interest rates rise? This slowly makes everything expensive. Housing loans, car loans, education loans, personal loans, all these things will become very expensive. This will cause a slowdown in the economy because what happens if, let's say, housing loans become very expensive, then you will not borrow, you might prefer to stay on the rent only, you will not borrow to buy a house, then the builder will not be able to sell whatever building or houses he's built. This will cause him to go in losses. He will need to let go of his engineers and laborers, so their salary will stop. Their salary stops, it causes even a bigger fall in demand because these people are not able to buy even basic necessities then. So it starts a vicious circle. Actually, uncontrolled fiscal deficits over several years start a vicious circle, and they ultimately leave a country much worse off economically than when it started. Now, let's take a look at the trend in fiscal deficit in India over the last 20 years in a chart to get an idea of where we are. Now, note that these fiscal deficit numbers should ideally all be negative because this is inflow minus outflow is deficit, right? But just for ease of showing on the chart, we've taken it as positive. But these are actually the extent of GDP by which our outflows have been more than our inflows. And if you remember in the last videos, we show it as percentage of GDP because one, it is a standard way of showing it across the world. And it also gives you a sense of the extent of the shortfall we have in the budget. Okay, so let's just quickly look at this chart. You can see that fiscal deficit used to be around 5.5 to 6.5% earlier in the earlier part of late 90s, early 2000s. Then in 2003, you can see a steep decline in fiscal deficit. In fact, if you see over here, the fiscal deficit actually fell from 6%. It used to be 6.56% in 2000, FY02, financial year 2002 and 2003, to 4.5 in FY04. What happened here? What changed? What happened was the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government passed the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act of 2003. The FRBM says a whole bunch of things, but since we are looking at fiscal deficit, let's just focus on that alone. The FRBM says cap fiscal deficit, cap fiscal deficit at 3% of GDP. So automatically the government started to curtail the amount of spending, and perhaps it increased some taxes at that time as well, which is why the fiscal deficit came down from 6% to 4.5. In 2004, the government was voted out, but this reform continued and we bottomed out at a fiscal deficit of 2.1% in 2008. This was during the Congress-led UPA government. In 2009 onwards, this is around the time of elections, the fiscal deficit started going up, massively. Now, remember what I said earlier, what's the easiest way to win elections? Just have a very expansionary fiscal policy. So you see from 2.1% in FY09, it went to again 5-6% levels, and it stayed that way for till FY13, where it was at 4.9%. Even in FY14, it was 4.5%. Now, since Narendra Modi government got elected, the Modi One government in 2014, the finance ministry has tried to curtail the fiscal deficit. Whether this was the right thing to do or wrong thing to do, given the current economic situation, is a different story. Right now, we are just looking at the history. So we'll stick to that. The government, Modi 1 and Modi 2, tried to control the fiscal excesses of the past. And you see a steady decline in the fiscal deficit as percentage of GDP. And for FY20, it is expected to be 3.3%. I don't think we will meet that target. We might exceed it by maybe 50 basis points and go to maybe 3.8, 3.9%, maybe slightly even touch 4.1% as well. But this was the target, 3.3%. So this is how the fiscal deficit has performed in the past. You saw how it did in different governments, what steps government took to ensure that no future government takes advantage of their position to just become very populist and keep getting elected. Now, one quick heading: tips and tricks to fool your friends. I mean, this is just a joke, and basically manipulation of fiscal deficit is what we are looking at. Okay. So, which is nothing but how to hide deficits without showing them in fiscal deficit. Now, this is possible because fiscal deficit only shows the difference between actual money inflows and actual money outflows, right? We've seen that earlier. So if a government, for example, gives oil bonds to companies instead of actually paying them for the oil and money, with cash, then it is not an actual outflow. Oil bond is just a promise to pay, that okay, I'll give you the bond right now, and this bond will mature maybe 5 years later, and that time I will pay you. But the year in which I issue the bond, it's not an actual outflow. So it will not be shown in the fiscal deficit. So as such, instruments like oil bonds cause fiscal deficit to look lower than it actually is. In other words, it causes the fiscal situation to look better when it is actually not that good. And this is a real worry. And maybe in a later video, I will talk about oil bonds and to the extent they were issued and what was their impact. But it was basically nothing but problems of this year, largesse of this year, for example, passed on to a next year, passed on to some future year for some other government to handle. So this was actually, in my view, humbly speaking, quite unethical of the past governments to do. And you could even call it window dressing of national accounts in some way. Anyway, now you have an idea of what fiscal deficit is. You know that if it goes out of control, it causes a crowding out effect, which eventually causes an economic slowdown. You know the steps that the Indian government has taken to ensure that no government does uncontrolled expansionary fiscal policy. We knew what Atal Bihari Vajpayee government did. We knew what UPA did in the interim, and we now know what the Narendra Modi government 1 and Narendra Modi government 2 are doing. So you have an overall handle of fiscal deficit. It's a summary of the budget, and it's a very closely watched number. Any slippages, basically actual fiscal deficit coming more than what was estimated, these are called slippages in fiscal deficit, are very closely watched by international investors as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please watch the last video and this video to start getting a good handle on the budget, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.